April 1946. The gates of Landsberg Prison creak open slowly. A line of gaunt, handcuffed inmates takes their final step, all and each to be executed for offenses so abhorrent the world mourned for justice. But what followed was even more humiliating than anyone could have wished. There were some who did not surrender. There were some who had accepted their destiny. And some others did not die as soon as they had wished. The war was over, but the war crimes were business as usual. It was not merely killings it was about. Whatever occurred in Landsberg's death room would prove to be one of the most controversial post-war actions. This is the short history of Landsberg Prison, where Nazi war crimes perpetrators received their comeuppance, but sorta not really, kind of not much as one would have expected. Landsberg Prison in Bavaria State, Germany, also had a bloody past years before World War II ended. It was in 1924, after the beer hall putsch failed, that Adolf Hitler was imprisoned here, a man who was at the peak of his career at that time. He dictated here Mein Kampf, a book that shaped Nazi orthodoxy. But after the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, Landsberg had another purpose. No longer solely a jail, it was then, under Allied occupation, a concentration of history's most malevolent men, Nazi war criminals, tried and convicted at the Nuremberg trials and other courts of war. It would become something else in a few years' time, an execution site. Who were the men executed? Those Landsberg prisons did not contain ordinary men. They were not ordinary top military commanders. Those were the men who had committed the Holocaust, the concentration camps, and massacres on an unimaginable scale. Between 1945 and 1951, over 250 convicted war criminals were executed by hanging in Landsberg, almost all by hanging. They were SS officers who had led large-scale massacres, Gestapo officials who had persecuted Jews and resistance guerrillas, Nazi bureaucrats who had planned the deportation of millions to death camps to be murdered, physicians who had experimented with prisoners using savage means. These were men who had run death factories, and now they were destined to face the hangman's rope. But their own destiny would not be swift nor benevolent. Imagine now the atmosphere in Landsberg Prison, later on April 7th, 1946. The jail is filthy, with a circle of chains. In their cold, dark cells, the men to be tried wait. Some pace back and forth, some sit in filthy silence. Others try to sleep, but their muffled breathing and shaking hands betray their fear. A flickering, dim light cast its beam over the gallows in the distance. The man behind, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, a name that, by this time, had a shameful reputation. At midnight, his actual name is announced. The prisoner is led down a long corridor, his footsteps echoing through the stillness. He is led out of doors into the gallows. A rope is placed around his neck. A soldier reads out the charges against him. No appeal at the last minute. No reprieve. The trapdoor creaks and screams. Something doesn't feel right, though. Rather than being killed instantly, the death row convict doesn't die. He strangulates, his body contorting into spasms of agony. Hanging has not worked. Either the rope is pulled too tightly, or there was defective math done on the weights. Instead of being instantaneously killed when his neck was broken, he was being strangulated to death. It would take over 20 minutes for some prisoners to die after having been hanged. The baddest of gangsters was Oswald Pohl, the highest-ranking SS administrative official in charge of the economic exploitation of concentration camp inmates. As the trapdoor creaked ajar, his spasmodic body jerked, but he lived through tormenting minutes. Similarly also perished Ernst Kaltenbrunner, another very experienced SS man directly involved in the final solution, his purple face distorted with struggle as he gritted his teeth in his struggles to introduce air into his lungs with each final desperate inhalation. His body jerked spasmodically before gratefully easing into death. It's a confusing observation. Even the hangman never knew whether the next man would kill immediately or slowly linger. But were these bungled hangings mistakes, or something more? Much of the anger over these hangings is reserved for one individual, John C. Woods. The most experienced executioner in the U.S. Army, Woods was officially assigned to carry out most of the Nazi war crime hangings following World War II. But the surprise twist, Woods was not a seasoned pro at getting the job done. Before the war, he pretended to be a veteran, professionally attired. He had no official training, however. His technique was brutal, sloppy, and irresponsible. Most hold him liable for willfully underestimating the hangings, sending the victims to languish longer than need be. Before Landsberg, his troubled Nuremberg hangings had already featured on the front pages, but Woods never cracked the math. In an interview, he famously stated, "I hung up those Nazis, and I'm glad I did. I wasn't afraid. A man can't be afraid of working on a job like this. But I have a queasy question. Was this justice, or was this revenge masquerading as justice? Justice or vengeance?" The debate rages on. The Landsberg executions are one of the most notorious incidents of post-war history. Others indicate that those men did not deserve mercy, their suffering a cheap price in relation to the millions they killed and tortured. Others argue over whether or not the trials were equitable. The detractors call the Nuremberg trials victor's justice, with the Allies doing the judging and due process in doubt. But to Holocaust survivors and their families, there was no question. Those murders had to be brought to account. The world was forced to send a powerful and permanent message. Genocide and war crimes will never go unpunished. But at what cost? What is Landsberg teaching us? The Landsberg atrocities were meant to punish the guilty and make sure that history never repeated itself. And they were a reminder that justice has to always be just. The ghosts of Landsberg Prison haunt us, that justice never has to be revenge. When justice oversteps that line, then it starts to resemble a lot of the crime it is condemning. Does it? Were the Landsberg massacres lawful, or had they crossed that line? Post a comment below and let me know. And if you enjoy Unseen History, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for further in-depth analysis of the past. Thanks for listening, and keep in mind, history is not the past, it's what we learn from it.